Our alliance has been shaped by the progress of our shared home in the Asian Pacific, and it's been for decades. Underwriting stability, seeding commerce, laying the groundwork for this region to reach its great potential. And here, in the early years of what surely will be the Pacific century, it's critical that America and Australia continue to look to one another for mutual support. Because together, I am absolutely confident we can write a better future for all our children and for this whole region.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to another United States Studies Center webinar. I'm Simon Jackman, Professor of Political Science and the Chief Executive Officer of the United States Studies Center, which stands here at the University of Sydney on the traditional lands of the Gadigal people, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Thank you for joining us for another Alliance at 70 themed webinar with our fabulous themed play-on video there that we're rolling at the start of these Alliance at 70 themed webinars. Later this week, Defence Minister Dutton and Foreign Minister Maurice Payne will complete a swing of 2+2 meetings, both through the region, culminating in Washington, DC for the annual AUSMIN Ministerial Consultations, where in the 2+2 format, of course, the Australian Defence and Foreign Minister sit face-to-face typically with their opposite numbers in the US, the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of State, respectively. This year's meetings, after a lot of toing and froing about how and when they might take place in the context of COVID, were due to be held here in Australia after a lot of negotiation, have been flipped back for 2 years running to be hosted by the USA in Washington, DC. And perhaps we'll get into some of the whys and wherefores around that detail of the meeting shortly. But what we wanted to do today was to draw on the fabulous expertise we have here at or affiliated with the United States Studies Center to give this meeting a preview. It is, of course, the first 2+2 AUSMIN under the Biden administration. And we've had, a change in the political complexion of the administration in the United States, quite obviously, while the coalition government remains in office here in Australia. So we go from a coalition government talking to the Trump administration to a coalition government talking to the Biden administration. The meetings are noteworthy in that respect, and of course also coming on the back of the very symbolic and significant anniversaries of the last couple of weeks, the 70th anniversary of ANZUS, and of course the 20th anniversary since 9/11. But the broader strategic context is, I think, the most important thing, certainly from the conversation we're about to have over the next 55 minutes, amid sharpening strategic competition with China and rising concerns about the direction of Biden's Indo-Pacific strategy, chief among the issues we'll be getting into in the minutes ahead. Critically, both countries have long, before under the Trump administration, this was the case and continues under the Biden administration, the US sort of talking about its commitment to uphold a stable, open, prosperous Indo-Pacific. Australia, I imagine, would like nothing better, but of course, will the rubber hit the road, and what indeed might emerge from this AUSMIN that gives voice to that long-held shared strategic aspiration. To have a conversation about what we might expect to see from AUSMIN, both at that very high level and perhaps some more specific things. We're joined by three of our experts here at the United States Study Center. And in the order that we'll get to on the run sheet, we'll start with some high-level framing remarks from Susanna Patton, who's a research fellow with us in the Foreign Policy and Defense Program. She joined us quite recently from the Australian government. She was a senior analyst in the Southeast Asia branch at ONI, the Office of National Intelligence, used to be ONA, pardon me, Australia's peak intelligence assessment, and there's the A part, assessment agency. We're delighted to have someone like Susanna come out of government and join us here at the centre. Susanna previously served in the ASEAN Australia Special Summit Task Force in the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, and had a posting as a diplomat in the Australian Embassy in Bangkok. Following Susanna, we'll flip to Ashley Townsend. Ash, of course, directs the Foreign Policy and Defense Program here at the US Study Center, covers a wide array of topics, obviously relevant to the topic at hand today: international security, strategic affairs with a focus on the Indo-Pacific, alliances, partnerships, maritime security, defense policy, US, Chinese, and Australian strategy. It keeps Ashley quite busy. And then we'll be hearing from Stephen Kirchner, another program director here at the Centre. Stephen directs our International Economy Program. He also has an affiliation with the Fraser Institute in Canada, and has worked broadly on topics around global trade, investment flows, and of course, with a critical sort of geostrategic overlay now, critical to any consideration of those topics, and that's certainly the case here at the United States Study Center. So the way we've got today structured is to get some, sorry, I forgot, Jennifer Jacket, of course, pardon me, that's another, that's my bad, sorry, lost count there. But Jennifer is a non-resident fellow here with us, not physically here in Sydney at the Study Centre, but she's currently on leave from the Australian government while pursuing a PhD as a Sir Roland Wilson Scholar at the National Security College at the ANU. And again, a little bit like Susanna, again, the ability for the Centre to draw on expertise of people either leaving government or still in government is terrific. Jennifer speaks in that capacity, still very much in the Australian government system. And so we're delighted that she's got the capacity to contribute to today's conversation. But Jen's expertise really covers emerging and advanced technologies, the implications of the development of those technologies for US allies and partners, Australia chief among them. And she's worked on a range of issues spanning critical infrastructure, foreign interference, counterterrorism, international defense engagement, and defense capability development. And Jennifer's joining us remotely from Canberra. I guess we're all remote by webinar today, but that's a longer than anticipated introduction to give everybody a proper introduction and make sure I actually covered everybody. Again, my apologies about that. But let's get into it. It's a full AUSMIN agenda. There's a lot to cover in a short amount of time. First cab off the rank, as it were. Susanna, the floor is yours for some framing remarks from you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Simon. So I might just add one point of context, which I think is useful, and then I'm going to discuss a little bit about what each Australia and the United States is looking to get out of the meeting. So AUSMIN is always important, but I think for Australia, especially so in 2021, because Australia has had less face-to-face contact with the new US administration than other key allies and partners like Japan, India, South Korea. The Prime Minister's scheduled bilateral meeting with the President at the G7 became a trilateral. So apart from Senator Payne's visit to Washington in May, we haven't had as much face-to-face political contact at the top level on these foreign affairs and defence issues. So that makes AUSMIN 2021 particularly important for Australia. So what's on the table? There's always a lot on the table, so I'm just going to highlight briefly 3 priorities for each side. Some of those are very much overlapping because Australia and the US see that they have shared interests. We're not talking about a zero-sum negotiation, but in some cases, differences of priorities or emphasis. So firstly, on the Australian side, what does Australia want? I think top thing for Australia is a strong US focus on the Indo-Pacific. Australia wants to see a delivery on the rebalance that was first promised by the Obama administration 10 years ago, but which is yet to substantially materialize. I think concerns about US bandwidth and potential for distraction, as we've seen with recent events in Afghanistan, are perennial. As a recent report from my colleagues and I in the Foreign Policy and Defence Programme highlighted, a particular concern is that since the US withdrew from the TPP, we see no comprehensive US economic strategy for the region, which we've argued is essential if it's to retain influence vis-a-vis China. On the Indo-Pacific, it's no coincidence that our ministers are in Washington at the end of a trip to Indonesia, India, and South Korea. That's very much about positioning Australia as an active diplomatic player in the region. 2 further priorities for the Australian side that my colleagues will speak to in detail are support on economic coercion that we're experiencing from China and access to the US defence industrial base, which has been flagged prominently by Defence Minister Patton. So what does the US want to get out of the meeting? A first priority, I think, is support for administration approaches to China. The US conceptualizes competition with China as a global competition of systems between autocracies and democracies over norms, especially on issues such as technology, cyber affairs, and infrastructure delivery. These, of course, are all in Australia's interests as well, but as we argue in our report, they're not exactly the same thing as a strong focus on the Indo-Pacific per se. Also on China, the US will want to see the meeting underscore peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. This is something we've seen the US push for in its other international engagements. That's part of a broader administration effort to shore up deterrence against Beijing. Second US interest will be in force posture announcements, which of course Ashley will speak to in more detail. And a third priority for the US will be climate change. Climate change has received a lot of attention in the media coverage in the lead up to AUSMIN. It's very clear that domestically and internationally, the Biden administration is looking to pull every lever that it has to address climate change. The US has suffered a series of devastating natural disasters over the summer, which I think will only have sharpened US interest in this topic. US officials like Kurt Campbell, the White House Indo-Pacific coordinator, John Kerry as climate envoy, his deputy, Jonathan Pershing, have been very explicit in their remarks, acknowledging the gap between where Australian policy is and where they would like it to be. In my personal view, that's an unfortunate perception that Australia should be looking to change. Our position on climate change, I think, arguably makes us a less attractive partner and perhaps gives us less standing to push for our own asks that we would have of the US. And moreover, a failure to address climate change within the alliance context also risks undermining public perceptions of the alliance, because we know that climate change is an important priority, especially for younger generations. That being said, as I think my comments made clear, climate change is not the only interest that the US has had or will have in AUSMIN this year. So the idea that that Australia is risking its position as an alliance partner if we don't pull our socks up on climate change, I think is incorrect. Ultimately, the moral, economic, environmental imperatives in favour of us changing our position on climate change are going to be more important than what happens specifically in the alliance context. And with that, I'll throw it back to Simon.
I was muted. Sorry. Ash, floor's yours. Thanks.
Thanks, Simon, and thanks, Susanna, for those comments. I'd certainly underscore the last one about the place of climate change in both alliance negotiations, but more broadly in Australia's regional strategy, and just add the footnote to that increasingly, this is an issue that affects all elements of US, Australian, all countries' national power, and in the United States, the Pentagon as well is paying increased attention to the significance of climate change on US basing posture, operations, and industrial base globally. The context point that I'd like to make for my remarks that will focus on munitions, Australia's push, that is, to acquire US support for the development of a munitions manufacturing capability here in Australia, as well as the ongoing debate and progress between Australia and the United States in building forward US military posture in the region. The context statement behind both of those things is that AUSMIN each year now is at some level about advancing a collective defence agenda in a more focused way than has been the case in the past. In the last 4 years, it's become clear that both countries publicly now agree and recognise that the United States military preponderance in the Indo-Pacific is past, and that in fact we are now very much in a Plan B era where both countries are working together collectively alongside other committed regional security partners like Japan, India to a certain degree and growing degree, and ROK, Singapore, the Philippines at times, and others to advance a networking agenda that can in some way offset and complement the United States extended security guarantees to Asian countries going forward. But there are, of course, obstacles on both sides of the Pacific when it comes to advancing this agenda, which is in part what AUSMIN is about addressing. So in the case of Australia's ambitions to produce long-range missiles in Australia, which is really a flow-on work agenda from last year's 2020 Defence Strategic Update. I think it's important to briefly articulate what Australia wants. Australia is looking to build, or to be able to build, a suite of different kinds of missiles here in Australia that will provide us with a greater degree of sovereign resilience, at a greater degree of defence industrial self-reliance, and greater latitude for independent and collective military strategy in the Indo-Pacific. Noting the continued rise in Chinese power and assertiveness in the region, it is the view of the Australian Department of Defence that long-range fires and often attributable cheap long-range systems will be increasingly important, both for Australia, for our regional partners, and for the United States, and it will help Australia do more for all of those actors. Why do we need the United States in this context? Well, we need US technical assistance and know-how in order to build out our own domestic ecosystem that could in time be integrated with the US supply chain, or the outset really, and interoperable with US systems. And to answer the obvious question, why can't Australia do it itself entirely? The answer is that there are just so many parts of the technology space that touch on US research and development or US industrial output, that at some level we will require the permission of the United States due to US legislation to use that componentry or that R&D in our systems one way or another. So getting US support for and input into our own domestic sovereign defence aspirations here is critical for the viability of the industry, for its alliance payoffs, and for the capacity for it to have a future, as the Australian government suggests that it will do in investing tens of billions of dollars over the next 20 years. We have a couple of different options and how this might play out at AUSMIN this year, but I would wager that ultimately we're going to see incremental progress. Australia could simply become involved more ambitiously in building components for long-range missiles. We could see the establishment of new sovereign or co-production initiatives that would see Australia produce either under license or in partnership with the United States different missile systems. I think it's unlikely that we will see the gold standard US support for Australian indigenous sovereign missile production in the short term. Part of the reasons for that is that the United States continues to present a number of obstacles to that kind of alliance empowerment. At the legislative level, the export controls like the international traffic and arms regulations pose problems for allies that want to build their own systems, including those with US support, but even those without US support. The Buy American legislation that both the Trump and the Biden administrations have endorsed and expanded make it less and less likely that the Pentagon will have a high degree of latitude to work with allies like Australia in a general sense in order to build advanced industrial defense capabilities. And I'll note that the markup of the NDAA, which is the annual authorization of US defense spending, has just last week flagged a potential increase to 100% Buy American. That's unlikely, but you do have that political pushback on buying systems from allies alive and well in the United States. And finally, the broader political point about the corporate interests of US defense industry not wanting to see those outsourced. There is a framework for fixing this. It is the National Technology and Industrial Base that was set up in 2017 to involve Australia. That is the piece of legislation, or really enabling legislation, that Defence Minister Peter Dutton has been loudly promoting here in Australia prior to his trip. But of course, it takes two to tango, and we haven't yet seen the progress on the US side to implementing the NTIB with allies like Australia, Britain, or even Canada, which has been a part of it for about 20 years, quickly or effectively. And that is because of those obstacles that I just outlined. So we'll be looking for progress on that front, but I do expect it to be incremental. Just briefly here, because of time, I wanted to touch on forward military posture in the region as well. It's now been 10 years since the US and Australia set up their initial force posture initiative, which in 2011 paved the way for the US rotational force of Marines in Darwin, as well as a few years later, the enhanced US-Australia Air Cooperation Initiative, again in Northern Australia. Both sides recognize the need to take this to the next level. One of the key issues on the table, or at least which ought to be on the table, is a broadening out of those force posture initiatives to include a maritime element, both in Northern Australia and in Western Australia. There are precedents for this. During the Iraq War, Australia and the Australian industrial base in Western Australia was directly involved in the refurbishment, replenishment, and maintenance of US warships in transiting through the Indian Ocean to Stirling in Western Australia, in an initiative that saw both that work done nationally as well as crews swapped out in Australia. And that was ended because of industrial concerns of the kind that I just alluded to in the discussion of munitions, where the United States didn't want to outsource those jobs to Australian industry rather than US industry. So you can see the shadow of this sort of pushback against an allied empowerment agenda on both of those issues. It's likely that we will see an expansion of the rotational presence of US Marines in Darwin. This is important not just for the alliance working together, but also increasingly the way that those posture initiatives pave the way for Australia to work with the US and other third parties in the region like Indonesia, Singapore, and so forth. It has a strategic policy upside in every respect, but it will require substantial effort on both sides to look not just at the basing and placing of US forces, but that enabling industrial base that is critical to the sustainment of any of those options. And I'll leave it there, Simon.
Thank you, Ash. Stephen Kirchner.
I think we've had a fairly good preview of where the AUSMIN communique, at least, is going to land on geoeconomic issues through the bilaterals Australia has already had in the run-up to AUSMIN through France, with France, Singapore, India, New Zealand, and Korea. All of those communiques called out economic coercion as an issue. And I would expect language at least as strong from the AUSMIN communique. And that language will obviously carry a lot more weight coming from the United States. I think this represents a concerted campaign on the part of the Australian government to multilateralise the issue of economic coercion. There's a safety in numbers aspect to this, where Canberra is keen to show to Beijing that we're not isolated on this issue. But I think what the Australian government is also trying to do is implicitly raise the threat of a collective response of some kind, especially if that coercion continues or escalates. Having said that, the US and its allies seem to be a long way from formulating, much less implementing, a framework for any kind of collective response. Although I note the EU is fairly well advanced in developing its own counter-coercion framework. In terms of substantive initiatives, though, I'm pessimistic that we will see much in the geoeconomic domain coming out of AUSMIN for a number of reasons. One is that the AUSMIN agenda is already pretty packed with defence-related issues. And while there's some overlap with geoeconomics in terms of defence industry, for example, I'd expect non-economic issues to take up a lot of AUSMIN's bandwidth. Secondly, there is the issue of whether AUSMIN in its present configuration is the right forum to prosecute that agenda, at least not without an expansion of that forum to include the economic principles from both sides, and indeed without further institutionalising AUSMIN in some way to give it more organisational capacity. Prime Minister Scott Morrison recently called for what would effectively be an economic AUSMIN that would tackle issues such as WTO reform, as well as economic coercion. And my interpretation of that call is that the Australian government sees the economic agenda as potentially one that's too big for the existing AUSMIN forum, and also that it's probably not as making as much progress on those issues as it would like through that forum. The idea of an economic AUSMIN, I think, was given greater weight by Treasurer Frydenberg's address to the ANU Crawford Leadership Forum recently, which I think demonstrated that issues of international security are looming very large for the Treasury portfolio, as well as the more traditional security-related portfolios. The danger in pursuing these issues through another forum, of course, is that it really just kicks the can down the road or even over the road, but without addressing or solving the underlying issues that have impeded progress through AUSMIN. The third reason why I'm downbeat on what we might see out of AUSMIN is constraints on the US side. The Biden administration at this time still has no meaningful trade policy to speak of. Everything is still under review, nor does it have a well-developed strategy for dealing with China in an Indo-Pacific or any other context. So there really isn't much of a strategy on the US side that initiatives coming out of AUSMIN could potentially tie into that would give substance to the sentiments that we might expect to see out of the AUSMIN communique. There are also potential points of tension between the Australian and US governments on a number of issues. So, for example, on issues of supply chain security, defence industry cooperation, and critical minerals. All of these areas potentially cut across domestic US policy interests, in particular domestic industry and employment policy. And I think this is going to be a big constraint, as Ash alluded to, on the US appetite for substantive cooperation in a lot of these areas of the type that the Australian government might want to see. In the area of trade policy, there is obviously tension with the US Phase 1 trade deal with China that has almost certainly contributed to trade diversion away from Australia, but remains US policy, and my sense is that the administration is just going to let that deal run its course. So overall, I think the Australian government will get the language it wants to see from the United States, but very little of the substantive measures that it might want to see from the administration.
Thanks so much, Stephen. And thank you for running to time. Much appreciated, said the moderator. Jen, floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. From my perspective, I think technological disruption is one of the issues that's central to Indo-Pacific security dynamics we are seeing play out, and also a key part of the backdrop for this AUSMIN. Advances in areas like artificial intelligence, quantum information science, and the Internet of Things are creating vast opportunities for prosperity, social connectivity, and well-being. But we've also seen those same technologies support the development of sophisticated military capabilities and create new vectors for cyber attacks, espionage, and disinformation.
And the result has been a redistribution of economic and military clout in our region, which has been evident in the effects of China's rise as a technology power. So I think for the United States, Australia, and also like-minded partners, these dynamics have prompted new concerns about the reliability, security, and diversity of critical technologies. We've seen issues like supply chain security being brought to the fore of national policy conversations. And at times, free market principles have had to make way for industry policy and regulatory interventions on issues like 5G security to support national resilience. And nowhere has this been more evident than in the United States, where strategic competition with China has really crystallized the sense of urgency with which the Biden administration is working to protect its critical technologies interests. We've seen largely bipartisan support for major legislative and funding initiatives to both protect and harness the opportunities of technologies over the long term, but also a series of more restrictive measures that are intended to de-risk technology cooperation with China. The important point here, though, is that the US actions alone are not going to maintain the US's long-held dominant technology position or ensure that technology develops in a way that aligns with liberal democratic values. That's going to be sustained by partnerships, and partnerships that involve government, industry, as well as multilateral institutions. And this is where the alliance comes in, and AUSMIN as one of those essential partnerships to advance the US and Australia's interests in critical technology. Building on an already long-standing relationship between Australia and the US in innovation, science, and research, Australia and the US can together play a particularly strong role in supporting an open and competitive innovation ecosystem, and one that's underpinned by strong global governance. There's already been a range of areas of cooperation that we've seen occur to support this, including best practice approaches to issues like 5G telecommunications, security, responses to malicious behavior in cyberspace, supply chain diversification in particular areas like critical minerals, and also growing space cooperation, particularly since the establishment of the Australian Space Agency in 2018. But I think what's clear is that the rapidly changing geopolitical environment around technology is driving sort of even stronger strategic imperatives to grow cooperation on technology issues. And this AUSMIN, there are a range of areas where that cooperation can be expanded. One is around continuing to deepen space industry cooperation through successful negotiations on a technology safeguards agreement that would allow closer US space industry cooperation in Australia. There's also scope for more funding around some of those critical research areas like quantum information science, and how that area of research can actually be fast-tracked into both commercial and military applications to support economic and military advantage. Both countries have also done a lot of work around protecting sensitive research. And so again, there are opportunities to share best practice about due diligence in the research sector. But I think where the Alliance can work most strongly on these issues is actually in groupings with other partners to help strengthen practical action and turn a lot of the positive rhetoric we've seen in forums like the Quad, the G7, ASEAN, and the UN into more of a practical agenda that can make a difference. And that includes in areas like sharing know-how and expertise on issues like digital resilience, more closely coordinating on technology standards, alignment in multilateral fora like the UN to ensure that technology is being developed and used in a way that aligns with liberal values like human rights. But also Australia and the US have substantial experience in major policy reforms around foreign investment and critical infrastructure regulation, which they can bring to bear in some of those groupings. So I think the final point is that the technological disruption that we're seeing today, this isn't sort of in the moment now. This is going to have impacts over many years and decades to come with implications for the Alliance. And I think this first AUSMIN under the Biden administration really presents a key opportunity to embed even deeper cooperation to maximize the benefits and minimize the risks of some of these technologies longer term. Thanks, Simon, back to you.
Okay. Thanks, everybody, and thanks, Jen. Look, I thought we'd do a quick whip round of some questions, and again, just to keep things simple, I'll proceed in the order of speakers. So, first is Susanna. Look, one thing that all four of you spoke to was this idea, and it's in a lot of our research here at the Centre, that the bilateral relationship, the Australia-US bilateral, ANZUS, the alliance, its significance is as much these days about how it's part of a regional ensemble of alliances and partnerships, this sort of regionalization of ANZUS that, yeah, there are some friction points in the bilateral, but the key thing is how it's contributing to this sort of broader regional goal, resilience, security, stability in the Indo-Pacific. From that context, Susanna, I'm wondering if you could talk about the significance of the fact that Ministers Dutton and Payne are doing quite the trip on their way to DC that goes through a lot of Indo-Pacific capitals on their way to Washington, what that means both substantively for the meetings in DC, the alliance in turn, and those broader strategic goals, but also the symbolism of it.
Sure, thanks, Simon. Well, I think one way I'd respond to that would be to echo something that Ash said, which is this idea that we're already in a kind of plan B mode, and we're very much seeing Australia looking both to the alliance, to the US to play a stronger role in the Indo-Pacific, but also that we in turn up our game as part of our alliance contribution. So we've seen that going back to, for example, last year's announcements that Australia made to increase its aid investments in Southeast Asia, and then this kind of regional outreach, some of which had pretty significant outcomes. For example, the outcomes on defence cooperation with India are quite substantive. And I think that's very much that Australia is seeing that as part of a sort of networking arrangement, including with respect to the Quad and so on. And on the Quad, I guess, it's really significant that our Prime Minister's first trip to Washington with this new administration will be for this upcoming Quad meeting later this month. And I think that really highlights very nicely the way that our bilateral alliance, but also those regional network arrangements like the Quad can be mutually reinforcing and really play to Australia's advantage. And I guess the stronger our relationships with all the other key players in the region are, the better positioned we will be to continue to develop those kind of network arrangements.
Thanks. Ash, Minister Dutton and Defence here in Australia, there's been quite a lot of releases and announcements about some of the initiatives underway. I think going back to the Defence Strategic Update last year through to the present, that sort of stepped up in tempo around onshoring some of that missile capability you alluded to. What's left in terms of announceables there, if putting your finger to the wind around what might come of it? You alluded to perhaps some more might be coming there. You also talked about something that you've written a lot about for both Australian and American audiences about NTIB, that Australia's role as part of the national technology industrial base in the US being sort of something that's really not had a lot of sort of substantive progress accompanying Australia's recognition as part of that base. Is this finally the AUSMIN where something gets delivered about that? Indeed, as Stephen Kirchner was alluding to, is this perhaps what the US, it is in their power to do in terms of sort of countering geoeconomics by opening the aperture, as we like to say, on those NTIB issues?
It's a great question. I think the answer is, yes and no. On the one hand, we have seen at AUSMINs recently, and I think we will see at this AUSMIN, incremental progress towards deepening at a project level, at least, US-Australia defence industrial cooperation, if not integration, on certain issues. We obviously saw it with rare earths a couple of years ago, where we're now wanting to see similar kinds of progress with munitions, as I mentioned, and I think there will be something there. I mean, it's worth noting for the audience, of course, that this is not beginning from a blank slate. The US and Australia, as Jen mentioned, cooperate on a range of fronts already, and co-production and co-development of systems is one way. It's a time-consuming way, but it's one way that both countries can work together from the ground up and circumvent or at least manage aspects of the legislative controls that the US places on its technology in third countries going forward. We're seeing that even right now in hypersonics with the Sci-Fi agreement, co-production of a hypersonic missile, which is extremely important stuff. So I don't want to suggest that there is no progress. I think the point to be made here is that the NTIB, which was set up and in many ways came out of McCain's office and chairmanship of the Senate Armed Services Committee, it is very, very ambitious. It recognizes, as Jen says, that the United States cannot go it alone when it comes to the technological underpinnings of its military power, in the same way as Susanna was just making the point with regards to policy initiatives. The United States cannot go it alone anymore. And I note Paul Madison's question in the Q&A as well. There needs to certainly be more give on both sides, but most especially in the United States, in order to find ways of operating together that empower allies, that provide a larger role for them, whether that's in terms of industry and access to US markets, whether that's in terms of the on-selling of technologies that have been co-developed to make Australian industry viable, or whether that's in a war planning context in terms of bringing the two countries together at a planning level and in an operational sense. Those things, I think, all come together in the term, we need to move beyond a superpower mindset in the way the United States does business with its allies and partners, and start to recognize that this is very much now a collaborative endeavor. The domestic political industrial economic interests in the United States that have always been in place, and which I'm not making any moral point on, are absolutely the sorts of things the US should be protecting, don't make sense when they encounter a great power rising like China, and the need for really significant collaboration with trusted allies and partners to meet a common challenge. And so I think, we will see some progress. I worry that incremental progress on a project level, AUSMIN after AUSMIN after AUSMIN, is not a very effective way at getting after this bigger challenge.
That's a great point, and thank you for drawing attention to Paul Madison's question that gets to that. We'll see if we can loop back to that, because I think it's a really important question. Stephen, and again, just picking up something you spoke to that I think, again, is implicit and occasionally explicit in everybody's comments, is to remark, I think quite helpfully, Stephen, that it is still the first year of the Biden administration. There aren't a lot of policy settings in place. I might come back to Ash and Susanna briefly to chime in on this, but Stephen, there's no trade policy. Two questions for you. First of all, and it's an audience question, Stephen, could you say a little bit more about is there evidence for trade diversion at the moment, that Australia is a net loser from what's going on the one hand, geoeconomic coercion from China, but US either with its own trade arrangements with China or just the way that markets work, that Australia is a net loser to the US perhaps at the moment? Is there evidence for that?
You never get knocked down evidence for trade diversion, but there's certainly been a significant loss of market share for Australia in a number of commodities and an increase in the US market share. And so while you can't say for certain whether trade diversion is taking place, certainly there's been a change in market share which would be consistent with that. And I think this is to China's advantage, because China, of course, is keen to maintain at least a superficial appearance of adherence to world trade rules. and trade diversion would potentially be an actionable thing from an Australian perspective. So it's actually helpful to China if they can maintain plausible deniability in relation to any trade diversion that might be taking place. I think it would be in the interests of both the United States and Australia for the US to remove the tariffs that it placed on Chinese imports, and to move away from the sort of managed trade arrangements that we saw with the phase one trade deal under the Trump administration. But as we saw with Trump, it took Trump about a year to gear up in relation to what he wanted to do on trade. We didn't really see any tariffs coming out of his administration until 2018. I think it will take probably a year for the Biden administration to gear up on trade. But in the interim, that leaves a lot of uncertainty as to where the administration will land and what risks that might pose for our trade relationships.
That gets to a second point. And again, I do want to get a domain-specific question to Jen, but just the ability of an institutional arrangement like AUSMIN to deal with sort of what is a very full agenda. A little bit of history here. Remember, AUSMIN really is an opportunistic response by Australia when New Zealand suspends. It's the third leg of ANZUS sort of goes into the deep freeze back in the 80s. That's really the start of the ANZUS Council became something different after that. I'm wondering, perhaps not in response to this question, but we'll just perhaps hold it for now. I do want to ask Jen a question about, for those of you who've worked in government or work in government, present tense, how much else is going on over the course of the work year versus what comes together in the 2+2 format? And is there more capacity there than we're seeing, working groups and whatnot, perhaps? Trade's a really interesting case, Stephen. Where does that sit? How do you meaningfully push trade issues now out? DFAT has a T in it, but in the US system, the Secretary of State, it's often, you've got USTR, you've got commerce, you've got Treasury, you've got other parts of the US government handling, and then you get into industry specific stuff. It might be energy, ag, you've got those other parts of the government. Real quickly, Stephen, you on sort of the institutional constraints there that accompany AUSMIN and when there's a big government to government agenda?
Yeah, I certainly think there's a big issue within the US government itself in relation to a lack of coordination between the US trade representative on the one hand and other arms of US international economic policy and domestic policy. This is something people in US government will tell you themselves, that they get frustrated by USTR basically going off on their own and doing their own thing. So I think there is an issue of policy coordination within the US government. I think there's also an issue of coordination with domestic policy. I don't think these things are terribly well integrated, partly because of the enormous ambition of what the Biden administration is trying to do. They're literally trying to spend trillions of dollars. Pushing that money out the door is an administratively burdensome undertaking. And so I think there are just huge bandwidth constraints within the US government. And in terms of AUSMIN, I think you alluded to the issue there, which is that AUSMIN was never really set up to handle a broad range of economic issues. It's always had a relatively narrow security focus, reflecting the fact that the ANZUS Treaty is a security treaty. There's almost no reference to economic or trade issues in that document. So this is one of the challenges that policymakers on both sides face, I think, which is the need to integrate international and domestic economic policy with international security policy in a way that they have not been used to doing before.
Yeah, fair enough. Jen, I do want to arc back to some of these bigger themes, but again, speaking of issues that haven't been on the Alliance agenda extant, but are certainly there now, critical technology is one of them. I guess it's such a broad domain. There are so many things that we might plausibly describe as critical / strategic technologies. Everything from 5G, quantum, you listed a ton of them. I'm guessing from where you sit, as much as you can talk about today, what's next cab off the rank? Ash reminded us that we had that progress in the alliance context on rare earths, aka critical materials, or a subset of that which we call critical materials. You mentioned space in your comments as well. I'm wondering, it just give you an opportunity to perhaps signpost where you think there might be the opportunity for something concrete, deliverable in the near term that we might see come out of a communique or some announceables later this week from Washington.
Thank you, Simon. Yeah, I think I've already mentioned a couple of what I would consider to be the higher priority areas for near-term cooperation, like 5G security, and we've touched on space as well. I think looking a bit further into the future, quantum information science, which I mentioned in passing, is one of those areas where I think deeper cooperation would be beneficial in both a commercial and military sense to both parties. The reason for that is that the science is still very much in the early stages, and we don't yet have a good sense of all the potential applications that we're likely to see both across the economy and in a military context that could be quite disruptive to the types of capabilities that we currently have in force today. So I think there's a lot of work to understand how might we as sort of allied forces leverage the benefits of quantum science for technologies in communications or in logistics optimization, but also how might potential adversaries use those technologies to disrupt some of the traditional advantages that we might have had. So I think although that area is very much on the alliance agenda, it's an issue that was talked about in one of the science and technology meetings held between Australia and the US last year. It's still very much a developing area of science, and I think additional investment in terms of research funding, but also technical cooperation on the potential applications and the disruptive effect that could have on military capability in particular. I think that's something where there's a lot of scope to do more.
And could well be one of those things where the trusted partner nature of the bilateral perhaps assumes a little more significance operationally than some of these other things where, yes, the bilateral elements of it's key, but only because it's embedded in that ensemble idea of regional alliances and partnerships. But when you get to things of enormous sort of sensitivity like that, that's where the sort of all the history on being a trusted partner perhaps comes into its own. For Susanna and Jen and Ash, I want to get you on this one as well. I pinged Stephen a little bit on it, and time is starting to get a little bit tight for us. So the idea that what can AUSMIN plausibly do by the time you're bringing the 2+2, the principles together? Is it more a consummation and they're working through an agenda of things that have been agreed to by working groups over the course of the work year? Or is real business actually being transacted? There are real things with the principles to work out face-to-face in real time. But the real work, and can you sort of, as much as you're comfortable doing so, pull the curtain back a little bit? And how much, Jen just alluded to a science and technology meeting between the two. We know certainly in the Intel space, there's got to be almost hour by hour, day to day, week to week cooperation going on. But when you've got an alliance agenda as full of this, what's really happening in that literally, what is it? At most 8 to maybe 12 hours that the principals might be together with some dinners and some public facing stuff, then the closed door stuff. How does this stuff really get managed and the business of government to government agreements get sorted? Perhaps Jen, since you're on camera, at least as I look, I'll put you on the spot on that one if you could.
Yeah, thank you, Simon. I might just make some sort of general
Sure.
remarks, and I'll leave it to maybe to Susanna and others to elaborate. I mean, I think it's fair to say that alliance cooperation is deep. It occurs across all portfolios in government. The regularity of conversations between Australian government officials and US officials, that is occurring all of the time. And I guess in the lead up to any major meeting of principals, there's a lot of work that goes on in the background to determine what those shared areas of interest are, what the key issues are that are worth sort of discussing face to face, particularly some of those trickier, more challenging issues. But I think where you see, things that are going to be announced, clearly there's a lot of work done in the lead up to sorry, just got some feedback, to negotiate and settle on those outcomes. But clearly the value of the face-to-face meeting, there's still, real opportunities to talk about key issues and sort of and push the agenda further than some of maybe that early work that takes place. But I'll let Susanna and others add to kind of what might happen on the day.
Fascinated to hear from both Susanna and Ash, in about 60 seconds each, I'm afraid. Thanks.
Just very briefly, I think the real advantage of a regular annual meeting like AUSMIN is that it focuses attention on Australia. I think, Australia is one of, many global allies and partners of the United States. We're perhaps a middle power. Some people don't like that term, but the opportunity to actually harness the time and the attention of principals is crucial. But of course, I think much of the discussion today has reflected the fact, I think the sentiment of your question, Simon, which is that many of these issues, if you're talking about defence industrial base, or if you're talking about the need for a US economic strategy in the Indo-Pacific, that lies well outside the remit of a forum like AUSMIN, because it involves the legislature, it involves other parts of the executive branch. And so we're not going to be able to get everything that we want out of one meeting, of course.
No, well said. And if I may, I think that speaks to the role that institutions like ours have in keeping the conversation going away from government over the course of the year. Ash, 60 seconds from you on that.
Yeah, look, briefly, from where Susanna led off, I think that this is one of the problems of a very under-institutionalized alliance like the US-Australia alliance. I mean, it's often said that the US and Australia don't need formal institutionalization because at every level there are relationships and a minister can pick up the phone and speak to his or her counterpart any time of day. That may well be true, but the agenda is heaving. It's full. There is a much greater need for coordination now than there perhaps was when ANZUS and when the alliance was established. And so this need to think about the architecture of the alliance and to optimize it for contemporary and future challenges, I think, is an urgent question.
Well said, Ash. And that dovetails very nicely with Paul Madison's excellent question about, look, as we increasingly inside both capitals talk about whole of government challenges, particularly in the US, where it's thinking of strategic competition with China, as we said earlier, as a systems level challenge. If you think about trying to drive coherence in your own government and then trying to drive coherence across a network of allies and partnerships, yes, bottom line, we temper our expectations about what might come from an annual 2+2. And this is often the case. The hard yards is done by, I think, colleagues of Jen's and formerly of Susanna's, but people to whom we're thinking of this week and many other parts of the year as well, and are in regular dialogue ourselves here at the US Study Centre, a big part of our charge and our mission. That brings us to the top of the hour. Look, as befits a very full alliance agenda, there was an awful lot to get through in an hour, and we could have probably gone a little bit longer. We're going to have quite a lot of op-eds and some media releases during the week. There are, of course, that work I alluded to, which is our core business here at the US Study Centre, reports on geoeconomics, Trust and Diversify, a report that we commissioned from external authors, went up on our website about a week or two ago. Stephen Kirshner's own view on the geoeconomic agenda in an alliance context, that'll be coming out later this month after AUSMIN, and aligned with perhaps some readouts or unreadouts on that matter from AUSMIN, and of course Ash and his team, an update on a very influential report that he and his team released in 2019 on averting crisis. But again, an assessment of US policy with respect to the Indo-Pacific, the matching of policy reality to sort of stated strategic aspirations, implications for Australia. That report went up on our website, I believe it was a week or two ago as well. So there's been plenty of content ahead of AUSMIN on these matters from the US Study Centre. Last word from me is to, again, just briefly thank everybody, Susanna, Stephen, Ash, Jennifer, thank you so much for your time, and to also thank two financial supporters of in particular of Ashley's part of the centre, and that's Northrop Grumman and Thales, whose generous financial support to what is at the end of the day a small think tank space in Australia. A little goes a long way in that context, and we're enormously indebted to both what Northrop and Thales are able to do to allow us to bring people onto the payroll, frankly, and build that body of work that helps provide away from government take on these issues over the course of the year that we provide here at the US Study Centre. And then finally, the very last thing, and Janine, I think we can throw that slide up now, thank you. And that is we're pleased to announce a yet to be titled event, but for now, it is, we're delighted to have an hour with Senator Penny Wong, Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs, Labor Party Senator from South Australia, Leader of the Opposition in the Senate. We've had the pleasure of hosting Senator Wong for an in-person event here at the University of Sydney. This one, by necessity, of course, will be an online virtual event, but an address from the Senator, and then some moderated conversation to follow. That is next Thursday at 10 a.m. And again, we're delighted to be able to continue this set of really distinguished speakers, and in the context of an awful lot in the Alliance agenda. The anniversaries are one thing, but then of course, AUSMIN, and of course, that will also coincide almost to the day with Morrison, Prime Minister Morrison, being in Washington for the Quad leaders meeting. So plenty going on in the Australia-US government-to-government relationship at the moment, and plenty hence for the US Study Centre to be talking about and to be sharing with you. Thank you, everybody, for another webinar. We'll see you